Welcome to The Watch Floor. I'm Sarah Adams. Today's episode is going to be a little different because we're going to talk about our recent visit to the Shawn Ryan Show. Obviously, he's not my boss. So, it's a different world. I work now under the Vigilance Elite team, and I want to tell you how that came about. So after my last, I think I did maybe 4 appearances, a lot of different viewers were reaching out to Shawn and different members of his team and kept saying, we want Sarah to come discuss X, or we want Sarah to come discuss Y. And Shawn just realized it doesn't really make sense to bring on Sarah every quarter. We should just have her addressing these questions in real time and getting the information out a lot quicker. And that's really where the watch floor came from. His team put this together so we can, address those interests, those concerns, and really talk about need-to-know information on a better scale. Because again, it's been 13 months since I was on the show, so a lot of time has passed. So when we got into the episode, we did discuss a number of things from the past. One, of course, is we spent a little more time on the Homeland plot, as the majority of questions that came into his show were regarding the plot, where it stands, those type of things. So one of the biggest Al-Qaeda signals about the plot in 2025 was in June, when AQAP released another video threatening that there's going to be a plot on the U.S. Homeland. So of course we discussed some of the cities involved. We discussed a little bit about the bombs. We spent a lot of time on the bombs. It is important. I explained to him that when we put different security practices into play, it then thwarts the terrorists in some way or prevents them from using a certain tool. And that tool historically was the shoe bomb. So luckily, when Al-Qaeda attempted the shoe bomb, moisture got in it and it didn't work. Well, of course, they corrected that problem very quickly. But the U.S. acted even faster by getting the right security procedures in place. And Al-Qaeda shelved the shoe bomb at the time. That's what we want to do. We want to stop them from being able to use a useful tool like that. Unfortunately, because it got announced by the US government that they're going to remove screening in a number of places for the shoe bomb now is basically in a prototype stage and is being tested again. So we will see, an attempted shoe bomb again in the future. And that's what happens. It's that give and take when you forget why a security procedure is in place and you forget your history, and we don't ever want to do that. Other things we talked about is some of the terrorists in the plot that were killed or wrapped up, because you want that to happen. Like, our goal is to impose costs to Al-Qaeda, to cause delays to Al-Qaeda, because every hiccup in their plan, and it keeps making them trip as they're on this race, affects the plot. And you want to affect the plot long enough to where hopefully law enforcement can swoop in and really stop pieces of it, right? The goal is to save Americans. Now, other things we discussed is, obviously in the United States, FBI is responsible for finding these terrorists on U.S. soil. It's just a fact. We brought up how we've passed over a dozen of these terrorists to the government, all across the government. And unfortunately, none of the terrorists that we shared with the government have been found or detained on U.S. soil. So that led us to releasing a couple of their identities, publicly. So everyone can get involved in looking for them. So we, of course, released a Saudi, and then most recently we released a Somali. So we want to give Americans a little more power and control over, hey, yes, I have put my family emergency plans in place. Yes, I am training. Yes, I am preparing. What else can I do? Like, where can I help in the see something, say something piece of this entire equation? Because it's going to take all of us, right, to protect our communities. That's very important. So we did go on to talk about how through all of 2025, I traveled around the country and did different briefings with law enforcement. I did it with Dave Boone Benton, and we even did, a couple with Scott Mann, and just talk through this plot and really how communities can prepare, or how law enforcement can put maybe other operating procedures into place to be better prepared against these plots. So we just said, hey, we had done it all year. We met thousands of law enforcement officers, and we really want communities to know there are really great people in your communities being proactive in trying to get ahead of this threat, and it's very important. We then discussed how we have, of course, a National Counterterrorism Center. It took a long time for them to bring on a head of it, but they brought on the head in August. It was Joe Kent, who's now the director, and he was previously a guest on the Shawn Ryan Show. So Joe came in, and then it was in September, he actually put out an unclassified memo to law enforcement saying Al-Qaeda has shown, at least publicly, these indications that they plan to do an attack on the U.S. homeland. So that was really great, because then law enforcement now had something in their hands to make decisions off of, to work on their training budgets around, et cetera. Unfortunately, a problem that came up when that happened is a lot of the fusion centers around the country who are supposed to take stuff from the ODNI and give it to law enforcement refused to share it. So we found this to be very interesting. And so we reached out to some of the people who sit in the fusion centers and some of the people who sit in JTTFs. And we were told in a number of cases, FBI was telling them not to share a government memo from NCTC, or really the ODNI, with local law enforcement, that the plot wasn't real, et cetera. So it was a very frustrating thing. We even found out the director of the FBI told a whole grouping of law enforcement officers in Texas that Al-Qaeda's homeland plotting was clickbait. So Al-Qaeda has put out 2 detailed videos on this plot, one in December 2023, and now this new one in June 2025. It's not like people are making up there's a plot. Al-Qaeda saying, hey, we're coming. It's time once again to bring America to its knees, right? That is their language that they're using. So we spent some time talking about some of their objectives when it comes to the plot, their goals, what they're saying to their actual fighters. So, viewers should find that pretty interesting. Another thing we went into is just, a little bit of updates on the Benghazi investigation. Of course, we're still actively working it. I spent some time telling him that even though we're trying to get our terrorists, there are forces who actually are trying to enable our terrorists and get them released. It's a very frustrating thing. But since we filmed, a really good thing happened. The U.S. government did bring one of our attackers, Zubair al-Bakush, from Libya to the United States, right? So it's a small win because he's not really on the senior level of our attacks. And unfortunately, he hasn't been really operationally active within these networks for about 10 years. So we don't think he's going to have the actionable information some of the more senior members are going to have. But I really hope it did put the Benghazi terrorists on notice to say, we're not only coming for Zubair, right? We want you, we're going to come get you. And there are a lot of people fighting to make that happen. So we're very excited about, some forward progress in that. And now we really want to kind of just break down the walls and go hard against these terrorists. Because as we said a number of times, some of these terrorists, especially Abdulazim Ali Musa bin Ali, are working on the Homeland plot. And they actually deploy terrorists here from North Africa, Syria, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, to do attacks here. So there are a number of our Benghazi attackers who can name terrorists on U.S. soil today. And I think that's a very important thing that we don't want to lose sight of. And we need to lean in, and being proactive against this. We spent, of course, time on Syria. The Syria policy when it comes to counterterrorism this year has completely failed. I mean, not only did we abandon the Kurds, we have massively enabled a resurgence of ISIS. I mean, everybody's frustrated about this. We've lost about 15 years of counterterrorism gains in less than a year. I mean, there's plenty of people now having moral injury like they did after we left Afghanistan. They're like, I went and served, I locked up these terrorists, and I had to watch them be freed from prison. The other problem is our government's telling us they're taking like 7,000 of these ISIS terrorists to move them into Iraq, where about 4,500 of them now have been moved. But they have yet to tell the American public how many of the ISIS terrorists were released and what's the plan to go hunt them down and recapture them. I mean, it was so much work to capture them previously, and likely the number is well over 1,500 of them have been released. 1,500. I mean, think of how just long it sometimes takes to get a senior terrorist. Heck, we just got a junior terrorist that was in Benghazi after 13 years, and really it's because he, had a stroke. And he's kind of easy to get, right? Because he's not really, very physical or active or could really go hide properly. He was just living a daily life in his apartment, etc. So it is a big problem. We also talked about how when you focus on terrorism in one place and then you ignore terrorism in another, of course the terrorists go in and take advantage of it. And the group that's done such a great job of that is JNIM, right? They're operating in Burkina Faso, Mali, and then kind of around, the border of Niger, and it's something that is really important. And we do have to focus on it because the interesting thing with JNIM, even though they're an affiliate of Al-Qaeda, they don't need them, right? They're able to fund themselves. A lot of it's through, of course, gold mines, but they are a dangerous actor. And it's just, one of those things, we don't spend a lot of time talking about it, but I do think last year JNIM did have the most civilian deaths of any terrorist group, which is interesting because for many years, ISIS held that role. Then we went into talking about a few things, that came up on the watch floor and things that people care about, of course, Somalia, Somaliland, etc. And we continue to take in, requests and comments for topics people want us to talk about. We did spend a little time in the episode talking about Epstein. Now, the emails hadn't been out for a long time. And then, of course, it was prior to Congress going in and saying, hey, not enough names are redacted. We need to see more names redacted, which has luckily happened. So, it's still this very frustrating thing for everybody because we do have this two-tiered system in the United States. And we're getting kind of like this crap response that, if we go after these pedophiles, it's going to crash our entire system and our entire democracy, which makes no sense, right? The people who founded this country would never want those individuals leading it in any possible way. They don't have, our moral compass, etc. So I'm really tired of the excuses. I think everybody is. So, we spent some time on that. And of course, there's a big focus of Shawn's right now, and it should be. We need to protect these children. And remember, it's not like there's only one Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein's one of thousands, right? He gave some of these people, some of these girls for a weekend or for a couple weeks in May, but people are supplying them to them all year long. And there's thousands of people who are harming these children all around the world. So if we're just going to give them a pass, then it just shows, we're really never going to protect children. And it's just, unfortunately, politicking to say so. And I think everybody's at the point we're frustrated. And we'd like to see, of course, harsher penalties against anybody harming children. And then we just like to get back to an America that, we can be proud of, and a government that looks more like us and really promotes our values, both at home and overseas. Now, we did at the end talk about some of my highlights from 2025. One of the things I didn't get into is just the different investigations I put out over the year, but I do think they're important to understand, just to understand what I'm still working on. So we put out an investigation, it was about 50 pages, into the Islamic State Khorasan province. The interesting thing is, and we spent time on this on the show, the money to the Taliban has not stopped. So when I started going up and talking to members of Congress about this, I kept getting the same answer from members of Congress. And it was the fact that the CIA and the Department of War said, we have to keep funding the Taliban to fight ISIS. So of course I pushed back and said, well, did you ever actually go see if that's true? Are the operations we're doing against ISIS in Afghanistan successful? Because the group's grown threefold. So that tells me there's something wrong initially with the operations. So we did about a year-long investigation, and what we did is we did twofold. We got the presentation the Taliban presents to the US government. And on 2 slides, they say, hey, we killed all of these senior Islamic State Khorasan province leaders. So we went through every person to find out, when they were killed, who killed them, what were the circumstances. And the crazy part is we found out half of them are alive. A couple of the pictures weren't people at all in the Islamic State Khorasan province. We found 2 guys who blew themselves up. And then we found a couple were actually killed by ISIS themselves because they were going to leave the group, or they were viewed as maybe spies, etc. So it was very, very interesting. So just from that grouping, we're like, okay, the Taliban's lying to the US government. They even told the US government they killed the number 2 of the Islamic State, Khorasan province. And so we located him 3 times since they made that lie to them. I think it was like around July of 2025, and we paid them a bounty for him. So that's crazy. So we just believed the Taliban at face value and paid them for killing a terrorist they never killed. The second piece of the investigation was just as interesting. We said, let's take every public ISIS operations Taliban claimed in their media and go on the ground and look into each of those operations. So we did that, and that's the whole second half of the paper. And the crazy part is they did operations on empty buildings. They did operations against our allies and murdered them and said they were ISIS. And in the worst situation, they did an operation where they took like a few teenagers. One was like, he worked on the streets selling goods. Everybody knew him in the area. They killed them, they executed them. And then they basically, this is horrible, I don't want to get too detailed, but they flipped them over and took pictures and sent it to the US government and said, we killed 3 members of ISIS. We got the photo of the 3 young gentlemen prior to being killed. So the face-on photo, and you can see 2 of them, are teens. And of course, we got their names and date of birth. So the crazy part is we're funding operations that in a lot of cases they're killing like Salafi clerics and saying they're linked to ISIS, and we're looking and they don't have any. They're killing some of our allies and saying they joined ISIS and it wasn't true. And then we have a situation where there's multiple situations, unfortunately, where they kill kids. So we're funding extrajudicial killings in Afghanistan. So that right there, it amazes me because that's against the law in the United States. We cannot use US taxpayer dollars to fund EJKs. So it was a really eye-opening investigation for us, but as you can imagine, it made no changes in the government, and they just still believe the lies of the Taliban because it's like they don't care enough. Another investigation we put out was on Abbey-gate. So we got a lot of requests from the families and people connected to the events. Hey, thanks for the dozen you put out. Can you go out one more step? Can you tell us, who let the attacker out of prison? Who helped facilitate these terrorists, et cetera? So we went out one more step. So we have now, I'd say, 24 terrorists named in that report, all responsible for the attack, in August of 2021 that killed 13 of our service members and about 170 Afghans. So, we're happy to put that out and give more targets. It's just getting the US government to be honest that that was a joint Islamic State Haqqani network attack because they lied and called it a lone wolf, and then getting them to be proactive and go after the people who carried it out. And we just haven't been able to make that kind of traction yet. So very frustrating. Then in September was kind of our biggest release of the year. We were able to get a couple photos of Hamza bin Laden out of Afghanistan. We had them for a while, but we finally thought it's long enough. We can release them. We had to remove the backgrounds. But just to get it out there and say, Hamza's very much alive, but also walk through the circumstances since 2019 when it was reported he was killed and how that happened and how the terrorists took advantage of that situation and fed information into the U.S. government to make them think they killed Hamza. The interesting part is it's not like we were taking a strike on Hamza. The terrorists came after the fact and said, hey, that incident killed him, which of course wasn't the case. But the interesting thing in that investigation is we also name other terrorists, and I brought one up on Shawn's show, like Abu Jihad al-Masri. So we brought up other very famous terrorists that we were told were killed in U.S. drone strikes, and they're very much alive. And this is really critical. So if we say someone died, let's say in 2009 or 2010, then nobody is tracking on them anymore. No one's collecting on them. They're essentially ghosts because you're not looking for a dead guy. So now we have these massive gaps for over 15 years on what some of these high-profile terrorists were doing. And we found dead terrorists even longer than 15 years ago. So terrorists we were told were dead that are alive right now in Afghanistan. It's been this huge problem. I'd say I found out in the last 2 to 3 years, 20 terrorists in Afghanistan that when I was in the U.S. government, we received information that they were dead. Well, this is a really scary thing when you think about it, because that means something's compromised somewhere. Now, it's very hard to get the U.S. government to say, oh, we fell for misinformation, or oh, we had a double agent. So it's not clear that they're actually going to go and do any sort of research to figure out how did we get this misinformation and correct it for the record. So I think we have a long way to go on that, but I just want people to be aware there's a lot of terrorists we're completely black on. Then we just spent a little time joking about some of the things that happened over the last year and just talking about, my time coming on the team. So it's been a whirlwind since I joined, the Shawn Ryan Show team and Vigilance Elite, but we've learned a lot together, and I hope we've put out a lot of information that is useful to you. I promise I have a very long list still of questions that came in, and we're going to try to address things as fast as we can and get through some of the topics we can get through. I've had a lot of questions about Al-Qaeda's aviation plot, so we're definitely going to be teeing that up for a future episode of The Watch Floor, and we really appreciate you tuning in. Thanks for being here.